So consuming web services, it's a good alternative to the .NET Business Data Connectivity model. Meaning that if you want to consume data, you don't want to have to build a model by scratch every time or build a .NET assembly shim. A nice thing to do sometimes is just to say, okay, we can easily build a WCF web service that represents whatever data source we have, and then we can go from that point and say, okay, now we can connect to it from SharePoint Designer and create our BCS external content type from that. And then you can, like we just saw, you can even export that and then, deploy it as a Visual Studio solution. So it's a good alternative. Like I just said, take that, what you've created in SharePoint Designer for consuming WCF, and just export it. Get that declarative model out of there, and then you can either import it into Central Admin, or you can deploy it as a feature. Okay, so the big thing right now in SharePoint 2013, one of the biggest improvements with business connectivity services is the support for OData. And in fact, for all of SharePoint, the big deal is that SharePoint Web Services, yes, there's still a classic WCF endpoint for SharePoint Web Services, but there's also a REST endpoint. So internally, they all go through the same, server API and everything, but it's just nice that it's exposed in different ways. So there's, Microsoft has implemented the adapter pattern to adapt different APIs to their internal object model. And so one of the new things is that the REST API is in SharePoint, and so REST stands for Representational State Transfer Service. And what it means is you can make an HTTP request to a resource, such as a list. You're going to an endpoint, a URL endpoint, and you get results formatted back in Atom, or you can get JSON, either one. JSON's usually better because it's a lot more compact, and you can specify in the header. The default is Atom. So the cool thing about the REST API is that any client can consume that, as long as that client supports standard REST and standard Open Data Protocol, OData syntax. And so that means you can now, connect to SharePoint data from Android devices, from iPads, from iPhones, Linux operating system, all these different things, anything that can consume REST. So that's huge. It opens up a whole world of possibilities with connecting to SharePoint data. And like I was saying, it's using the same SharePoint Web Service endpoint as the client-side object model, so client.svc. This is a nice thing that they added. So instead of having to go to _VTI bin _VTI bin / client service, you can just go _API for the REST endpoint. So the client object model method would be list.getByTitle with list name. But if you want to do REST, you would just use a URL, and you would just basically just submit this GET request with this URL going to that endpoint, and then you would get back the Atom data, or if you specified JSON, you'd get back JSON data. Now OData works in conjunction with REST, so it's very useful when we're querying against lists. Saves writing lots of code, and it supports retrieving specific columns, so you could say, I only want the title column back in my results. So you would do your standard REST query, and then at the end you would put this query string, and that would be using OData in conjunction with REST. You can do filtering. There's a ton of OData protocol choices that you have. There's lots of features in the OData protocol, and SharePoint implements pretty much all of them. There's some that it doesn't, but for the most part it does all of them. You can even do joins via lookup fields. Sorting, so you can have things sorted on the server instead of on the client. Okay, so we just kind of did like a real quick primer on REST and OData and what that is. And so now what SharePoint has done with BCS and SharePoint 2013 is one of the big features they've added to BCS is support for the OData protocol, which makes total sense because if SharePoint is exposing all of its OData, it might as well be able to consume OData sources as well. So that means you can connect to, not only can you get data from database or get data from WCF, you can also get any OData source out there, data from any OData source. There's out-of-the-box support in Visual Studio for this, and Visual Studio will auto-generate a BDC metadata model if you point it at the at an OData endpoint. But there's a caveat: it has to be an app, not a farm solution, and you can't use SharePoint Designer. So I beat myself up over on this for a while because I wanted to be able to use the a BDC metadata model in a farm solution. I didn't want to create an app, and I thought, well, maybe the only way you can do this is you have to create an app. You're forced to create an app. It's not so. What you can do, there's a trick that I'm going to show you here. You'll see the trick, and hopefully this is valuable to you. But we're going to look at, in this demo, we're going to use REST and OData to query external lists. Okay, in this demo, we're going to look at take a look at REST and OData, and then a little bit about how SharePoint supports that, and then also we're going to consume OData. We'll use Visual Studio for that. So first of all, here's our site collection. We have our external list here, Northwind customers, and so the interesting thing here is that SharePoint provides the REST API to pretty much everything, all the data in SharePoint, pretty much, or at least it has client-side object model for that. And so you can use REST requests to get at the data. So one of the things that's really important, which I think is really, really a powerful concept that may not really have been intentional, but because with business connectivity services, when we bring in external data and then it becomes a list in SharePoint, well, now, because it's a list in SharePoint, it also gets to take advantage of all of the REST API goodness, right? So just like I could do REST queries on a regular list, I can also do those REST queries on an external list. And so if you think about that for a minute, let's say, for example, you have a data source in your organization, and maybe it has a database, but nobody ever wrote a back-end service for it, and it'd be really nice to have a web service so people can consume that data from other devices, maybe a Windows Phone or Android or iPhone or whatever, or maybe even just another web app, and without having to go directly at the database. And so, interestingly enough, if you bring that data into SharePoint and you can expose it as an external list, well, guess what? You just instantly created a web service for that list, as long as the web requests or the REST requests are going into the SharePoint site with the right URL. You're going to be able to retrieve data, even do updates on that data if you have it set up correctly. So that's pretty powerful. You can basically instantly have a web services API for whatever data source you have. It's kind of a cheap way to do it too. So it's interesting. So I wanted to show you that here. I'm going to just do like a really quick REST query here. Let me, you know what? I have something I can copy here. So first of all, I'm just going to do this. Let's copy and paste this in. So this is just going to get the metadata of the list. So if I go to the source, you can see the XML. So this is just all the metadata about the list itself. It's not the actual list items. But then what I can do is, if I just add items at the end of it, now I'm getting all 91 items. So I am getting the items. And again, if I go to view the source, you can see here's all the XML. So what all I've done so far is these are just REST calls. I can add some OData in there too, though. I can say I can do top equals 4, so that's an OData protocol that says, okay, just give me the top 4 records. And if I do that, boom. So I'm using OData. I'm querying using the OData protocol on a SharePoint list. So SharePoint doesn't care if it's external or internal. It's just SharePoint's treating it as a list, even though this happens to be an external list. So I'm making these requests against an external list that's hosted in SharePoint. That's pretty cool. So now the other way around, we need to be able to, let's say there is an OData source that you need to consume. If you want VCS to consume an OData source, can't do that in SharePoint Designer. SharePoint Designer will, we've seen these choices before. I just want to show it again real quick. If I say new external content type, and if I go to, say if I want to add a connection, so I can look, SharePoint Designer knows about .NET types, and knows about SQL Server, and then WCF. So that's great. If somebody has already built some WCF services that you want to connect to, that's great. What most people are building nowadays, though, are REST web services using OData Protocol. So you can't connect to that using SharePoint Designer, but with Visual Studio you can. So I have, let's go back to our project. It's our Visual Studio solution here. I'm going to add a new project. So what we're going to do is we're going to connect, there's a publicly hosted Northwind Traders OData service, and it's Microsoft publicly hosted. It's just for testing. We're going to connect to that. So there's a trick here. This is a really big trick, because if you're trying to do this on just with a regular farm solution, you can't do this because Visual Studio wants you to use the new app model for SharePoint 2013, which we're not going to be covering that in this course, but what I can do here, I'm going to add a new project. So I'm going to create an app, even though I don't have my server configured to work with apps. So it's not going to, it won't work if I try to run the project, but that's okay. Let's see. So I'll just say app for SharePoint 2013, click OK. So it'll create that. I'll just click finish. SharePoint hosted is fine. So I'm not going to be actually running the app. So you'll see the trick that I'm going to do here, though. So while that's running, I'm going to get, let's see if I can get on my desktop. Okay, here is the URL. Whoops. Okay. That's the Northwind OData URL. Okay, finally created. So now I'm going to add a new item. Actually, let's do this. This is what I need to do right here. So this threw me for a loop. Actually, it just threw me for a loop again. I'm always used to going adding a new item to my project, but you don't actually do that. So you go to, it looks like you click add, and it looks like you want to click new item, but actually what you have to do is there's another menu item here on this context menu called content types for an external data source. So this is where you have to click this and then specify the URL, and I'll just call it Northwind. Call it Northwind OData. Say next. So now it's actually calling out to that web service and getting the metadata. So to get all the data entities that we can use. So I'm just going to pick customers, and then this is actually going to create list instances for these entities. So I'll click finish. Okay, so now you can see I have this customers element here for an external content type, but I don't want to use it in an app. I don't want it to be an app hosted external content type. But what I can do is I can open this in File Explorer and go to external content types, Northwind OData, and that is the file that I need right there. So it creates an ECT for external content type. That's actually just a model. So if I open that, it's just a BDC model, is all it is. So I'll just save that on the desktop. And I'm going to go into, I could use Visual Studio, but for now I'm going to show you how to do this using Central Admin. So I'm going to go into the BDC service app, and I'm just going to import it. And I'll go into, that's fine, go to the desktop, customers.ect, I want it to be model, I'll just import that. Okay, the model was imported. You can see it's right here. That's the new model. Okay, so now let's go back to the site. I'm going to just actually I'm going to do this in SharePoint Designer. It's a little bit easier. I'm going to delete that external list that's already there. I'll just delete Northwind customers. And we'll create a new one. But this one's going to be based on that OData source. Okay, and we want to base this on an external, list. And we'll call it, let's call it Northwind customers again. External content type, just type in Northwind. Let's see if we can find that. That's fine. It's Northwind. We want Northwind customers. So we'll choose that, Northwind customer, because that's Northwind OData. And we'll say create. And now we have our new external list. This is going against the publicly hosted OData service from Microsoft. So you can see there's the data coming from that web service. So what we just did is we showed how you can consume data from using OData. You can actually consume, on the client side, consume external content type data as a list in SharePoint using OData, and then how we can also consume OData sources using business connectivity services. And I just want to show like one other example that I have here. I actually have I had a customer where I was writing some code for that they needed to keep track of their stores, and that we needed to be able to actually use that store data in some client scripts. So basically when a user would have a store associated with their profile, and then we needed that store, once we had the store data, the data from the profile, the store ID that they're associated with, we actually had an external list in our site of all the stores, and it had a bunch of metadata about the stores like the address and zip code. So I needed to get the zip code of the store, and so I had this little JavaScript file. Let me just double click and open that. So I thought that was kind of an interesting use. So what I did was, you can see here's the method here, get store list items, and the name of, I had an external list called store marking location. And so you can see here I was able to do a camel query on that. This is interesting. It took me a while to figure this out, but all the examples that we're using client-side object model or using camel queries against list, they never show using the view fields element right here. When you do a camel query against an external list, you have to include view fields. And the fields that you include here have to match what's in this include clause right here. So that's the key to make this work. So if you get those two lined up correctly, then it'll work. So you can see my camel query here. I'm just I have a store ID. I'm just making a camel query to get the data for a particular store. And so, and I have I'm using jQuery, so I'm using promises here. So you can see I have, it's all asynchronous. and then this gets called when the method calls back after it gets the data. It calls this method, and it just enumerates and gets the value. So in this case, I wanted to get the I can pass in a field name and get a value. So in my case, I was passing in, I think the field name was zip code, so I could get the correct zip code that the store was in. So I was using that to display like a weather widget for the user based on what store they were associated with. But I was querying that external content list right here, and that was using the client-side object model in JavaScript. So I thought that was pretty interesting. It's an interesting use. Again, because I had it as an external list, I have a way of getting that data via jQuery, and have basically had an instant web service because I brought that in as that database table as external data, because nobody in the organization built a web service for that, and I needed to consume it as a web service from this app right here. So, or this, basically this was all put into a content query or a script editor web part on a regular publishing page. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So anyway, that is a kind of a good summary of how to use business connectivity services, how to consume, how to use OData, how to consume OData using BCS.